Hello and welcome to this, the fourth in our series of P2 webinars. Today, of course, we'll be looking at the value-added PMO, something that P2 has a long track record with, as I'm sure you'll be aware. We're going to do a couple of things today over the next half hour. We're going to look at the brief look at the history of PMOs, look at the key principles that underpin PMOs and the key value that I believe a PMO needs to derive, and then we'll have a bit more of a detailed look at the makeup of that, the controls, and so on and so forth, before we finish off with a short look at metrics and maturity transformations. For those who've joined us before, you'll be aware that we're going to talk over the next half hour. There's usually not time for questions, but we do come back afterwards. So if you do have any questions, please do feel free to write them in, and we'll get back to you in the next 24 hours with an answer of those. And of course, we're recording these, so we'll be sending those out to everyone who's joined. So do feel free to review those and enjoy. But before we get into the detail of the PMO, for those who've not come across P2 before, allow me to provide a brief introduction. P2's the global transformation PMO that we've established over the last 7 years. And we really look to do a number of really important things. For us, it's all about helping our clients transform and providing them with a real alternative to the big four. We do that through delivering our 3 P2 promises. So our promises are to improve, control and deliver on our clients' transformation ambitions. And we do that through the 12 underlying services, which you can see there. Now, today's service we're going to talk about specifically is, of course, P2 PMO Plus. There. So, if that's what we do, let me introduce you to 2 people on the call. There's myself, Adam Skinner. Hello, and Gary. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, so Gary Stoneley, joined P2 back in 2016. Background in retail, financial services, and engineering. Quite a bit of experience in delivering agile and waterfall programs and projects, and running PMOs.
Great stuff. Thanks, Gary. That's appreciated. And Gary will be talking a bit later on in this webinar. So let's jump in quickly to a brief history lesson around PMOs, because as Maya Angelou says, if you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going to. And I borrowed this slide from a good friend of mine, Ralph Finchett, and many of you may know Ralph Finchett from PMO Planet. He's a really interesting person around PMOs and does a lot of useful stuff on LinkedIn, so worth looking into. Ralph really talks about PMOs in terms of 3 versions of PMOs: PMO 1, PMO 2, and PMO 3. And if we think about sort of the timelines that PMOs have been around, actually the concept of a PMO didn't really appear until 2001 when Dave March brought out his influential project and program support offices. Before then, of course, projects and programs had PSOs, but didn't really have a structured PMO. It's interesting to think that actually that occurs around the same time that the Agile Manifesto was drafted. So we tend to think of Agile as a kind of very new concept, but in some ways it predates the concept of the PMO. So PMO version 1, it was this concept of transactional PMO, essentially a coordination of PSOs doing administrative support for project managers and the like. Fast forward to about 2008, and of course P3A comes out then, the OGC's flagship manual looking at projects, programs and portfolio offices. And around about 2011 you of course had Scrum, Scaled Agile, and management of portfolio. So all of those things kind of came together to create a concept of a PMO that here is referred to as the emerging PMO. And I tend to think of that as a sort of almost a top-down PMO, a PMO that looks down into projects and programs and helps coordinate those, adding a huge amount of extra value to what goes on in that in the delivery of those projects and programs and portfolios. In many ways, that's what we're still left with. Ralph talks about something called version 3, the digital PMO, which in his words is a PMO that essentially sits at the strategic level with an organization that doesn't really make a distinction between change, because being digital is always changing. And so the digital PMO helps the entire organization to continually change, as you'd see in Scaled Agile. I'm not quite sure we're there yet for many organizations, but it's certainly something that we can aspire to. So if that, in a nutshell, is the history of PMO, let's strip it back slightly and have a look at what the value of the PMO might be. And I think it's a really interesting question, because there's an awful lot of things that PMOs can do. Actually, what could an office do even? You can collate accurate and trusted information. You can help the organization run smoothly. You can build and police reporting and delivery frameworks, and I do love this phrase, you can act as the conscience of the organization. And all those things have huge amounts of value in the PMO, in any kind of office. But the real question I think it's worth asking is, where does the value sit in all that activity? And to help you understand a bit more about my take on value, I thought I'd explain a bit more about the first time I worked in an office. And for those of you who remember your TV, on the right, I've just flicked up a picture of Yes Minister. Yes Minister was, of course, a classic BBC sitcom about a load of people who worked in government. And of course, on the left, you've got Jim Hacker, who was Minister of Department for Administrative Affairs, and of course, the wonderful Nigel Hawthorne as Sir Humphrey, the Cabinet Secretary. But the person I wanted to focus on is the chap on the right, Bernard Woolley, who was essentially the private secretary. And private secretary was the first role I ever did in an office in Treasury for a lady called Dawn Primrose, who was the Paymaster General. The role of private secretary is a really interesting one. You're essentially running the office for some really kind of high-powered, important people. You're helping them get to the right place. You're trying to smooth out their day, and you're also acting as a conduit between the people in government, and the ministers, how making sure information flows naturally between those two groups. And the interesting thing is you're dealing with an awful lot of incredibly important decision makers. And I always remember speaking to an old grandee, an old civil service grandee, and saying, it's really exciting to work around all these really important decision makers. I'd love to be doing that one day. And he looked me deep in the eyes and he said, Adam, you do something far more important. You are a decision enabler. And I really think that's an important concept when we think about the office, and particularly the program management office, because for me, the absolutely fundamental value that any sort of office can and should be delivering for the organization it works in is to enable that organization and create an environment conducive to good decision making. That sounds like a really simple statement, but there's an awful lot that goes under that. And I like to think of it as two things, really. It's about creating an environment for effective decision making, and that's about making sure the information is there at the right time, presented in a really accessible way, and with the right recommendation on the side, because a really big part of helping people make decisions is having the confidence to provide them with a recommendation that helps them in the route that they need to go. So all of that for me is around supporting effective decision making. And efficient decision making is really setting up the structure that helps other people make decisions. So is the governance there? Is the organization there to feed into that governance, the right number of people, the right capability? Are the processes in place that allow people to do the tasks they need to do and see the decisions they need to make and the ways of working? And is the communication there to allow both people to know which decisions need to be made and make sure that once those decisions have been made, they can be implemented successfully? So for me, if you put me on the spot and say, Adam, what do you think the real value of any sort of office is? It's absolutely embedded in the ability to create an environment conducive to good decision making. So we've talked a little bit about history. We've talked a little bit about value. Let me also now touch on something I spent an awful lot of time talking about, and I call it the Watson Appy question, because we tend to use the phrase PMO as a little bit of a catch-all and kind of dodge often what that first P stands for. But whatever it stands for, it can mean an awful lot. And we in P2 tend to think about PMOs in 5 different boxes. And this isn't a universal, there's a lot of different models for that, but this is the one that we particularly sort of sign up for. So if you go down to the sort of the bottom level of that, almost you might think of almost the classic project office. We call that the project support office, and it's really the sort of PMO structure, we call it the PSO structure, that supports your IT projects and your change projects to actually just deliver. Moving up a level, you get to the program and the outcome level. So actually the larger PMOs, the larger lean agile PMOs that sit over programs and communities of projects that are trying to deliver outcomes. For us, there's the program PMO, that's sort of the classic waterfall PMO sitting over a program, and of course the lean agile PMO, which we did a webinar on last week, which is more linked to sort of larger scaled agile type transformations. You move up a level, you look at the portfolio PMO, the portfolio management office, which sits at that investment portfolio level, making sure that the portfolio is both doing the right thing and doing the thing right. And again, if you want to hear a bit more about that, we did a webinar 3-4 weeks ago that focused on introduction to portfolio management. And then at the top level, you have what we class as the strategic PMO. And the strategic PMO is, for me, the thing that works alongside the board and the executive, both doing a lot of the portfolio management activities, but also supporting the board and the exec to decide what their overarching strategy should be. So really 5 levels of PMOs. A lot of our focus is both at the portfolio level and, of course, at the program PMO level. So we've talked a little bit about the history, we've talked a bit about Watson Appy. Let's actually get now into the meat and bones of the program management office itself. And here we're going to take you through something that's a really powerful tool here in P2. We call it the PMO Dougs Donut, after Doug Elliott, who was one of the founders of P2 and came up with the original model for this, a real guru when it comes to PMOs. And it's something that served us incredibly well over our many years. What this model really does for us is allow us to talk about the kind of 3 big things that we worry about when it comes to setting up a good PMO. And that's, what are the outcomes you want from that PMO? What are the principles you want to operate in that PMO? And finally, what are the controls that sit under that PMO? So if I look at the outcomes, first of all, and this is really around making sure we're delivering that great value of supporting decision making. There's really 2 outcomes we push for. One we call leadership, and leadership's really about sort of setting up the PMO correctly, working and to set up the wider organizations, being a voice in that organization, helping provide the information in a really helpful form that helps people make decisions, and really acting as a coach and a mentor around those PMs and PMOs. What I tend to think of as the leadership aspect of my outcome is around enabling decision making in the organization. And the flip side of that is what we call delivery assurance. This is really about our ability to look into all that great data that we're sitting on in the PMO, to integrate that and to try and spot stuff that nobody else is spotting. So to look for the problems that have not yet been spotted, to raise them up, to recommend how they'll be resolved, and to drive those resolutions to completion. And that's through kind of information management, it's through health checks, stage gates, it's for all that good recovery planning and the like. So if I was to put one phrase around delivery assurance, it's really about trying to work out what decisions need to be made, what decisions we need to be making around risks and issues and so on. So leadership is around enabling the environment. Delivery assurance is about pumping the decisions through the system that need to be made to help support delivery and help reduce the risk of delivery. So if those are the 2 key outcomes, what are the principles we operate in? Well, we really have 4 key principles. And I like to think of principles as, if you like, your ways of working, your general behaviors that should be underpinning what you're doing in the PMO. And we've got 4, as I say. So governance, probably the first one I talk about. So governance, that classic thing about, are we establishing an environment and a governance framework that supports people to see and make decisions whilst minimizing bureaucracy? And it's that second one that's often the hard one when it comes to setting up the PMO. It's terribly easy to stick a load of boards in there and stick a load of people on those boards. It's quite hard to strip that out to make sure it's doing it in the leanest way possible. Coaching, a hugely important thing. I'm particularly keen in this world of agile and scaled agile. For me, coaching is about being a center of excellence, having set up the tools and templates, having set up the frameworks and the ways of working, and then actually working with the wider organization and business stakeholders to help them understand what they should be doing in this space and what good looks like. Coaching and standing alongside them to succeed. Illuminate is very much that classic PMO activity of being able to look into the data, finding new stuff to say about that data, and provide early warnings to support people to make the right decisions and avoid things going wrong. And the 4th thing is support. It's often overlooked, but it's a really important one. And for me, the support is just really being a good group of people who are there to help. The really interesting test there is the people grown when the PMO gets mentioned or comes in the room, or people are generally glad to see you there. They generally see you as a group of people who are there to help and deliver success, as opposed to just put blockers in place. So 2 key outcomes, 4 principles around delivering that decision-making value. But all that really is just sort of fancy words and aspirations I hear you say. What does the PMO actually do? And that's where we come to our 3rd most important space. And that's what we call the engine room. And the engine room is, if you like, the thing that delivers all those key controls, all that activity, and it's the thing that combines all the processes, all the people, all the tools and the techniques and stuff that actually happens to deliver everything else. Now, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm now going to hand over to Gary Stoneley, who's going to discuss this in a bit more detail. Gary, over to you.
Thanks, Adam. So over the next 7 minutes or so, I'm aiming to answer 3 key questions relating to PMO services. The first question is, what is this engine room that Adam's alluded to? Well, it's based upon the 3 PMO themes. It's based upon, number 1, leadership, providing insight through reporting and being that trusted counsel for the leadership team. Number 2, it's about the engine room, which is all about gathering, consolidating and crunching that project data using one or more of the PMO services. And thirdly, it's about assurance, providing that early warning system of future problems, but more importantly, with time to do something about it. Those themes are supported by the 4 pillars of the engine room. First one being reporting, traditionally vertically throughout the organization. Second one is finance, your standard planned versus actual spend. Third one is planning, traditional milestones, plan on a page, progress reporting, RAG status, etc. And the 4th one is governance, setting terms of reference and tracking those key decisions and actions throughout the program. Essentially, the engine room supports the program or project in making better informed decisions. The second question is, what is a good example of a PMO service? So we're going to use dependency management here, which would traditionally be delivered by people, such as a planner who would manage external dependencies working with the respective PMs. They would be operating a tool, which is often centrally, such as SharePoint, to store, monitor and update the dependencies, following a process. That process may be weekly dependency updates, integrating those into the MSP, revising the risk register for those dependencies where the risks have changed. All of these are documented within what we call our dependency service blueprint, and this outlines the who, the what, the when, and the how. Essentially, we're using this engine room to provide the assurance, insights into the leadership team. So again, that talks about the 3 elements that Adam mentioned previously. And then on to the third and final question. How do we tie all this together through a value-added PMO service catalog? Well, the problem that we often see is these progress controls, PMO controls, are in place, but are not often used effectively. So as an example, risks and issues such as triaging risks, categorizing them, assigning them a rating and monitoring those, these often happen, but they're often a standalone activity. Another example is the planning function, such as monitoring work done, outlining or calling out late milestones. This will often tell us what has happened, but not what will happen in the future. And basically, we're using these controls quite rightly, but we're not using them in a way that is optimal. So if we're going to run a high-performing value-added PMO, we need to start combining the data from these various controls and helping the program get onto the front foot. As an example, multiple data sources coming to the same conclusion would show that we can trust the project data, whereas multiple data sources coming to different conclusions often surfaces previously unknown risk. So a couple of examples of this. If we were to use Jira to track work done, whether that be waterfall or agile, and then compare that to the task status within the MSP, the Microsoft Project Plan, Jira may be telling us that we're 40% through the work done, but the MSP may be telling us that we're 80% through the work done. So that may call out the action to go away and just consider whether we are actually on track or behind and whether we need to re-baseline. The point being that we may not have picked up on that had we not triangulated that data together. Another example would be project spend versus the MSP status. So in isolation, the project spend may be saying 50% done. we spent 50% of the budget, which may be completely accurate. However, if we've only completed 20% of the tasks, the action may be there. Let's go away and analyze whether we are actually on track, or whether we may need to ask for additional funds in the future. Again, we may have missed this if we didn't start to triangulate that data and compare different sources to come to the same conclusion. So the message is pretty clear. In order to have a value-added PMO, we do not simply replicate project data. Rather, we triangulate that data to unlock insight to support decision-making. So hopefully, I've answered the 3 questions that we mentioned at the beginning. What is the PMO engine room? What is a good example of a PMO service? And more importantly, how do we increase the value of the PMO to provide that insight by triangulating data sources? So thanks for listening, and back to Adam.
Thanks, Gary. I appreciate that. And just to re-emphasize that really important point, the PMO is not just there to take information from the PM and pass it up to the program director. It's entirely about actually how do you add value to that information to help make decisions that people couldn't already make if you weren't there. Really important stuff. So just to expand slightly on what Gary's been talking about there, this is an example of one of our PMO handbooks, or PMO service catalogs, you might want to call it, essentially allowing us to sort of say, what are the key services I'm going to be offering in the PMO? And I'm often asked, what does a good one of these look like? So I thought I'd share a couple of examples of that. So for instance, you've got here your kind of higher level service catalog. Below that, I expect each of the services to be able to articulate, what is the sub-service that service is offering? What does it feel like, most importantly, for the individuals experiencing it? How often it's going to be done? What process delivers that? And what the tools that underpin that? So anyone can come into that and look at the kind of flow of services. I'd expect there to be a process flow to talk about what we're going to be doing, so anyone can engage with that and see how it ties into their daily schedule and what they need to be doing. And I'd expect a drop down below that to talk about the procedures involved in there, the tools involved in there, the format of those tools, and whether it's an input or an output. So essentially, you're almost taking a sort of blueprinty, targeted operating model approach to the PMO. And that's really to help you explain the key services that are being offered, the people doing those services, the tools involved in those services, and the processes that drop out of the other end. So we've talked about a few things. So we talked about the history. We've talked a bit about what we think a really good PMO looks like and what underpins that and the service involved. So hopefully an awful lot of you are thinking about that, and you're going to be kind of going away and having a think about how you might want to improve or transform your own PMO. And so I thought it'd be quite helpful if I spent a few minutes just talking about how we approach the challenge of maturity and how we approach the challenge of actually sort of transforming your PMO. So I'm going to share with you essentially a very high level look at what our framework for a maturity assessment is. And if you look at a lot of maturity assessments out there, they tend to focus on 1 or 2 things, usually around the kind of processes and the activities. So what are the processes, the controls that a PMO does? What level of maturity are those processes and controls at? I mean, that's a really important part of the mix, but it is only one part of the mix, and we'd strongly recommend you thinking about a couple of other areas. You'll see there's 3 pillars here. So the first would be leadership, culture, and climate, and that's really about saying, how is the PMO being led? Is it operating in a climate of continuous improvement, a safe environment to work? Do people enjoy working in there, and so on and so forth? Really important aspects to try and make sure your PMO can continuously improve and continuously develop, which it absolutely has to do to stay relevant to the organization. The second one is about people behavior and partnerships, and there's a really important thing here about technical competency. So I've got a planning service. Are my planners properly competent and capable? That's really important. But as important are the non-technical competencies, because so much about PMOs these days is not just about pushing information. It's about engaging with people. It's about serving people. It's about understanding how to package information to support decision making. All of that is soft skills stuff. So it's very important to have some way of measuring the softer capabilities, the non-technical skills of the people in your PMO, to check that they are the right sort of people. The last thing you want is somebody who's very comfortable locked away in a little room just pumping paper around. You need somebody who wants to get out there and get engaged. Of course, the third pillar is those process structures and practices. And you can't get away from that. You then generally need to know what services you're offering. You need to understand how you do those, what the policies that underpin those, and what level of maturity those are at. But none of that has any value except when you look at it against the vectors we've got at the top there, which is around the PMO customer experience and PMO customer success. So the PMO only has value if it is supporting its customers to succeed. And therefore, you need to take a really hard look at what do the customers of the PMO do? What is success for them, and how can the PMO, how can the experience those customers have with the PMO help them deliver that? If you don't understand that, you can't even begin to understand what level of maturity your PMO is at and what level it needs to get to. So, for me, maturity, a really important aspect, but it's multifaceted and it's really, really customer-centric. Which is a terrible phrase, but actually a really quite helpful one, I think, in this case. So that sort of looks at how one might want to look at the maturity of one's PMO. The next question is, well, why would you even do that? And I think maturity is a really interesting thing because it's an entirely useless concept on its own. You know, I'm a maturity of 2, I'm a maturity of 3. What do you do? You know, it is only valuable if you can use it as trending information. In other words, if you know what direction you're taking maturity in and what rate you need to do it at. It's kind of almost a velocity concept. You need speed and direction. So maturity itself is entirely valueless unless you can hook it into some form of transformation plan, unless you can be sitting there and saying, well, I know what my maturity is now. I've spoken to my customers. I know where my maturity needs to get to, and therefore I can create a plan, a journey that we're going to go along, and I can projectize that. The other really important thing I'd say about that is very few maturity transformation plans survive contact with the enemy, as it were. It's incredibly important to have one. It's incredibly important to focus on what it needs to do over the next couple of months. But you've also got to be very, very flexible with that, because actually your needs and your priorities are going to change. So have that strategic review of transformation, but be very comfortable about checking where the maturity needs to go and readjusting as you go through. Just say we do an awful lot of these sort of maturity assessments, and as I say, it's so important to finish the conversation with, and this is the direction you need to go in now. But like I say, it's all about the customer when it comes to PMO maturity and the value it needs to add. So final things to talk about, I think, is probably the question of actually how do you measure the value you're offering. And I'm being slightly flippant here and saying that there's only one metric that matters. There's a huge number of metrics that matter, obviously, particularly when it comes to how healthy your program organization is. But there's a really important metric in the PMO that I think gets missed a lot, and it's a really important one that says actually how good a function how good your PMO is functioning. And that's a really simple one, actually, and it's around tasks and actions. It's around tasks and actions as a proxy for decisions. And we would like to do really 3 things around tasks and actions. For those of you familiar with Agile, there's something about sort of treating tasks and actions almost like Agile stories and actually seeing how they go through the Kanban board. So you might want to do a couple of things. You might want to look at your action working process. So how many actions do you have on the go within your forums at any one time? If you're finding them getting stuck at a particular stage, you've almost certainly got a problem. So they're either getting stuck, kind of people aren't coming to you with actions or tasks or change requests that needs to be kind of decisionized, in which case they don't really trust governance, or those tasks and actions and decisions are getting stuck during the flow. The other thing we would like to look like is the average life cycle. So how long does an action take to be opened to closure? And that's a really good proxy for how good your organization is at making decisions. And finally, and you can never beat this, customer sentiment. Have you spoken to some of the real customers of some of those decision-making forums, both formal and informal, and found out whether they like it or not, what they like about that process? It's always incredibly insightful to have that conversation and have them tell you, yes, it's working, or no, it's not, and it could be better because you need to do X, Y, or Z. So have a real think about that, because I guarantee it's not something that is commonly done in PMOs when men measuring the value of the PMO, but it's a really, really powerful metric. So we're very, very close to the end of our allotted half hour. As I hope you can tell, we like talking about PMOs quite a lot here at P2, and there's quite a lot of other resources we've got available if you want to learn a bit more. We've done a couple of webinars, though. We did one on the Lean Agile PMO last week and one on Introduction to Portfolio Management about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and you can get access to all of those through the P2 webinar site, which will be emailed after this session. We've also got a P2 YouTube channel where we put up a whole range of videos. There's a couple you might find interesting. So there's one about transforming your PMO the Agile way, where I talk for about an hour about how you drive a PMO transformation in a very agile and adaptive fashion, which you may find useful if you're looking to do a maturity transformation. Predictive analytics is a really big one, and evolving a PMO is kind of looking at the future of PMOs, and that pictures me talking at the Manchester Comedy Store as it happens for a future PMO event about that topic. So all of those can be accessed on the YouTube channel. Well, that's about it, really. Thank you very much for joining us as ever. We've got a couple of more webinars coming up soon. So in about 2 weeks' time, I'll be talking about adaptive delivery, which is our bespoke transformation methodology that looks to combine agile and waterfall to get to the value very, very iteratively and quickly. And on the 21st, there's going to be a really important one, I think. So some of you may have joined us for our project hibernation session a few weeks ago when we looked at how to mothball projects, given the strange times we're in. Those times aren't going to last forever. In a short while, we hope people will be starting to think about how to bring their portfolio out of hibernation. So we're doing a lot of thinking about this. And on the 21st, we'll be having a dedicated session to look at how one can reboot one project so they're ready for success. So please do try and join us for that. So that's our half hour. We'll be dropping the webinars out to you off the back of this, so you can have this recording to keep as long as you wish, and we'll hopefully get back to you with the questions in the next 24 hours. Thanks as ever for joining us.